In 1981, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to neuropsychologist Roger Sperry, who proved that if you sever the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, two completely independent conscious entities emerge within a single skull. They develop different desires, different beliefs, and one hand can literally snatch objects from the other. Your sense of a unified personality disintegrates with one precise scalpel incision. Decades later, a 2008 experiment at the Max Planck Institute showed that neural networks formulate a decision in a subconscious void up to 10 seconds before you are even aware of it. Your body acts, and the very feeling that you personally made this decision is generated by the brain after the fact, like a beautiful special effect. That perceived inner eye supposedly controlling your life is a neurobiological illusion, a system commentator perpetually late to the broadcast. Now let's turn to math. Donald Hoffman's interface theory of perception, proven using evolutionary game theory, states an uncompromising fact. The probability that you are seeing objective reality right now is exactly 0. The physical world around you is a controlled hallucination continuously constructed by your brain in real time. Human perception is meticulously tuned for biological survival, never for truth. Here, an unsolvable paradox is born. If each of the some 8 billion people generates their own personal, isolated hologram of reality, why are our holograms perfectly synchronized? If every brain projects its own self-generated world, why do we all collectively agree on the shapes, distances, and density of matter? Out of this problem was born the concept of solipsism, the idea that only you and your perspective exist, while everything else, including other people, has no point of view of its own, existing merely as an appearance generated specifically for you. Yet this concept ultimately pales completely and falls short in the face of millennia-old teaching on non-duality. The grand illusion is not only the surrounding world, but also the separate observer itself. Your brain constructs the feeling of an isolated, perceiving I in the exact same way it constructs the color of an apple or the sound of the wind. At a fundamental level, both the physical world and the one observing it are inseparable elements of a single, continuous process. But if reality is truly one, and you, as a separate entity, never actually existed, then who exactly are other people? Are we all just dreaming each other into being, forming a shared, coordinated illusion? Or is the deeper truth that this world is not limited by your individual mind at all? To dismantle this paradox of a shared reality, we will first have to take apart the very person looking at it right now. Since childhood, you have likely lived with an unshakable feeling. It seems to you that somewhere in there, seated right behind your eyes, is a little passenger who controls the body, hears sounds, makes decisions, and calls themselves by your name. But modern neuroscience proves a simple fact. There is no single command center in the brain. Place a person in an MRI scanner, ask them to think about themselves, about their plans, fears, or memories, and a specific architecture of neurons lights up. It is called the default mode network, or DMN. This is not the vault of your soul. It is a limiting valve. It intercepts thoughts and continuously glues them together into a unified illusion, a fabricated story about who you are. However, the brain is not a factory manufacturing consciousness out of a piece of flesh. It is a receiver, a quantum antenna. The main task of the brain is not to show you the truth, but to hide it. Working as an evolutionary filter, it cuts off perhaps 99.9% of incoming information, and from the remaining crumbs, it pieces together not only a 3D model of the room around you, but the very idea of me. Suppress the activity of this network through deep meditation or specific chemical compounds, and something astonishing happens. The feeling that you are a separate person disappears completely. Yet consciousness itself does not power down. On the contrary, it becomes crystal clear. When the interface of the personality is unplugged, only the pure process of life itself remains, unfolding without anyone there to live it. Try to find this separate I right now. Look inside yourself. You will find thoughts. You will notice a pulse, a tension in your head, the rhythm of breath in your chest. But you will not find the one looking at all of this. That is because all these sensations, including the thought, I exist, are merely objects. Objects exactly like cars passing by on the street. They flash within an empty, boundless space of awareness and vanish. Contemporary non-duality teacher Tony Parsons, who experienced a total collapse of this illusion during a simple walk, describes it this way. Enlightenment is not something that happens to someone. It is the sudden realization that there is no one here. There is no one to wake up and no one to live. There is only life itself, which right now is playfully pretending to be you. That persistent feeling of a separate I is not your eternal soul. It is simply a geolocation program, an interface created solely so this specific biological avatar could survive, defend its boundaries, and reproduce in an illusory material world. But if there is no little master residing inside this avatar, and the entire physical world is merely a projection of the brain, an important question arises. What exactly are our minds connected to if billions of seemingly empty biological avatars see the exact same world? Consider the architecture of any multiplayer online game. Inside it, let's say, you see elves, mountains, and castles. You and a friend can walk up to the exact same virtual tree and hit it with a sword simultaneously. You both see the identical tree. Does this tree exist physically? No. Inside your computers, there is neither bark nor leaves. There is only a unified server, a central database storing immaterial information code. You see the same world not because it consists of solid matter, but because your local devices are connected to a single server and use the exact same operating system to decode the data. In our reality, this foundational server is the unified field, infinite consciousness, the ultimate source. Your biological bodies serve as those very decoding devices. Because all humans share practically identical genetic code, our sensory hardware unpacks the data of the universe using the exact same biological algorithm. We all see the same moon because we are running identical neurobiological drivers. If you were to open that exact same information file through the sensory hardware of a snake or a bat, the moon would render into something completely different. But if all this is merely code being broadcast into billions of receivers, and only one consciousness exists, then do my child, my enemy, and the random passerby exist separately from me? Or is this entire multiplicity of faces just an illusion? Both are true. This multiplicity is indeed the greatest illusion, but at the same time, they are absolutely real, just in a completely different way than you are used to thinking. Philosopher Bernardo Kastrup offers a brilliant metaphor for how a unified consciousness can become a multitude of different people without actually dividing into pieces. Imagine an infinite ocean where the water flows freely. Occasionally, in different parts of this ocean, the water swirls into localized whirlpools. A whirlpool has a clear boundary and a shape. It seems like a separate object existing entirely on its own. You might say, look, here is a whirlpool and there is the ocean. But can you lift the whirlpool out of the ocean? No, because the whirlpool is not a separate object. It is simply a temporary behavior of the water itself. There is nothing inside the whirlpool except water. Every person on this planet is just such a whirlpool, a temporary localization of the unified consciousness. You possess your own thoughts, your own views, and your own unique memories. This biographical information swirls tightly within your boundary. The person sitting next to you is their own distinct whirlpool, churning with their own problems. You appear to each other as separate people. But what are you actually made of? Of the exact same water. Of the exact same pure awareness. Why did the unified source ever need to swirl into billions of different vortices? Because without this dynamic play, there would be absolutely nothing. In order for the infinite consciousness to experience, to feel love, to know fear, and to play the magnificent game of evolution, it required the illusion of multiplicity and separation. It needed to shatter itself into myriads of localized fragments, each of which would purposefully forget who it truly is. Our mind righteously protests this. If all this is merely the cosmic game of the one, then this source is a cruel sadist. Why did it create a world containing wars, diseases, violence, and so much human pain? The mistake is that we once again imagine the source as an external creator sitting on a cloud, torturing tiny subjects for entertainment. But the radical truth is, there are no others here. Recall your most terrifying nightmare. The horrific monster chasing you and the terrified victim are woven from the exact same sleeping mind of yours. No one is torturing anyone from the outside. In the world of forms, it is impossible to create only light. Any lived experience in a dualistic reality demands contrast. Otherwise, it will not be recognized as an experience. To paint a picture, you must employ deep shadows, or else there will be no picture. Without the bitter, we would never recognize the sweet. Without destruction, there would be no creation. The ocean does not feel pain when two of its waves violently crash into each other. Pain is felt exclusively by the whirlpool that has identified so strongly with its shape that it believes it can shatter or die. Other people do exist within the strict framework of this illusion. They have their own bodies, their own memories, and their own pain. But on a fundamental level, they are not strangers. Looking into the eyes of a random passerby, you are literally looking at yourself, simply grown under different conditions, with a different background and set of beliefs. The difference between you is only in the content of the experience, but that silent presence looking at the world from their eyes right now is absolutely identical to the presence looking from yours. And yet, never forget that this impenetrable illusion can be broken physically. What happens to people in that moment, science still awkwardly calls an anomaly. We call it awakening. For a long time, it was believed that enlightenment was a metaphorical, purely spiritual experience, something relegated to the realm of esotericism. But modern neuroscientists show that awakening leaves a definitive physical trace that can be observed even on MRI scans. Materialistic science was built for decades upon a simple and logical axiom. The brain generates consciousness, exactly the same way a mechanical projector generates an image. Therefore, if you reduce processor activity, the picture should dim, shrink, and fade away. But when scientists placed masters of deep meditation and people experiencing total ego dissolution into MRI scanners, they discovered something astonishing. The activity of their brains, especially the areas responsible for self-identification, dropped to almost zero. Yet consciousness did not dim. On the contrary, it exploded with incredible clarity, became all-encompassing, and transcended the bounds of space and time. People described it as merging with the one source. You cannot get an 8K resolution picture by smashing half the processor in your television. How can a massive reduction in computational power lead to such a grandiose expansion of consciousness? The answer is elegant. The brain does not produce consciousness, it limits it. We have already mentioned the default mode network, or DMN, the biological center of our ego. Returning to Bernardo Kastrup's metaphor, the default mode network acts as the very walls of the whirlpool that make the water believe it is separate from the ocean. The brain works as an evolutionary filter. Consciousness contains all the information of the universe simultaneously, but it is physically impossible to survive with such a volume of data in the world. You wouldn't be able to cross the street if you felt oneness with every single atom of the asphalt. Therefore, the brain straps a virtual reality headset on you, cutting off perhaps 99.9% of reality so the little biological avatar can survive. When you restrict this cognitive valve during meditation, your brain doesn't generate unified consciousness. It simply stops blocking it, allowing the flow to finally break through. Your rational mind will inevitably object. Hold on. What if you give a person general anesthesia and completely shut down the brain? Consciousness just vanishes into nothingness. Doesn't this prove that I am the brain? And how do we even know consciousness remains if there is nothing there? It is an excellent question, which conceals a clever trap. It confuses pure consciousness with objects and the biological apparatus of memory. In deep meditation, your limiter is turned off, but your recording device continues to run smoothly. It records this experience of boundlessness so you can talk about it later. Anesthesia does something else entirely. It unplugs the entire interface of the avatar from the wall. It completely powers down the reality rendering mechanism. Remember the interface theory. Imagine you are playing an incredibly realistic virtual reality game. Suddenly, the anesthetist unplugs the heavy cable of your headset from the socket. The virtual forest, the ambient sounds, the very time and space of the game vanish instantly. Does this forest exist without you? No, the game is off. But did you, the one wearing the headset, disappear? No. You simply found yourself outside the simulation, resting in total peace, where there are no forms, no time, and no boundaries. But our biological mind needs objects in order to record a memory. When you wake up, the headset turns back on. The mind consults the memory, finds not a single recorded file or anchor to time, and makes a false conclusion. There was a void. I didn't exist. But it wasn't that you didn't exist. You simply didn't exist as a separate character inside the simulation. You were in a state of pure being, which your avatar is fundamentally incapable of recording. A state where consciousness no longer compulsively compresses to the size of a single body is an absolutely real, provable, physiological process. Let's look at people to whom this has happened. Take Gary Weber, PhD, a hardcore physicist and materialist. Gary meditated for many years, simply trying to reduce stress. One morning, while doing his usual stretching, the voice in his head just turned off forever. His internal monologue vanished. Gary underwent a functional MRI scan at Yale University, which showed his default mode network, that very ego zone, was practically deactivated. At the same time, he retained a brilliant mind, continued to manage laboratories, and wrote scientific papers. It's just that the whirlpool was no longer spinning. Only the pure ocean of perception remained. But sometimes, you don't even need spiritual practices for the system to mysteriously glitch. It happens as a result of an extreme biological shock. John Wren Lewis was a British mathematician and scientist, completely far removed from esoteric pursuits. In 1983, while traveling in Thailand, he ate a poisoned sweet offered by a mugger and plunged into a deep coma. When doctors pulled him back from the brink of death, John opened his eyes and realized the old him was no more. The suffocating feeling of separateness had disappeared. He was no longer looking at the world from inside his skull. He felt like an infinite, shining space in which the hospital, the doctors, and his own body were floating. John lived in a state of continuous bliss for the rest of his life, trying to scientifically explain what had happened to him. Or consider the striking phenomenon of U.G. Krishnamurti, who famously called his awakening a calamity. He claimed it was a purely physiological mutation, during which the entire illusion of a command center collapsed. The fictional owner, who always claimed the body's actions as his own, simply shut down. The biological receptors started working directly. Eyes saw, ears heard, the body acted. But inside, there was no longer a frantic commentator claiming this for himself, saying, "I am seeing this." Thoughts only arose in him as a reflex reaction to an external stimulus, for example, if someone asked him a question. But as soon as the stimulus disappeared, a complete physiological silence set in. A logical question arises. If the isolated I does not exist, and the brain is merely a limiting filter, then who exactly is trying to comprehend these words right now? A little biological robot, or infinite consciousness itself? The beautiful paradox is that infinite consciousness itself is trying to comprehend this right now, having gotten so caught up playing in its own virtual reality that it sincerely believed it was you. It is not the brain that is looking, it is the infinite, temporarily gazing upon this rendered world through the exceptionally narrow keyhole of your personality. When words are spoken about the physical world being a hologram, a digital simulation, or the dream of a unified consciousness, any self-respecting materialist will inevitably ask the exact same snarky question. If all this is just an illusion and solid matter doesn't actually exist, why don't you go out on the highway and step in front of a speeding truck? This argument usually confuses the meaning of the words illusory and unreal. An illusion does not mean that a thing does not exist at all. An illusion simply means that a thing is not what it appears to be. Remember Donald Hoffman's interface theory. You look at your computer desktop and see a small, blue, square folder. Does it exist? Yes. You can click on it, you can drag it. But is it actually a physical blue square? No. At a fundamental hardware level, it is just magnetic fields on a hard drive and millions of zipping electrons. The icon is a graphical illusion, a metaphor created for your convenience. But if you take this illusory icon and drag it into the equally illusory trash can, you might lose weeks of perfectly real work. The rules of the interface are absolute and uncompromising for those operating inside that interface. Your physical body is exactly the same kind of desktop interface, a biological avatar. It is woven from the very same quantum code as the heavy truck speeding toward you. If one element of the code collides with another at high speed inside the simulation, the avatar will be critically damaged or deleted. The excruciating pain you will experience is not proof that the world consists of solid matter. Pain is simply a flawlessly functioning signal from the security system of your virtual reality headset. It is the scream of the evolutionary filter. Do not do this. You will break the decoding device. You, as infinite consciousness, will not suffer at all from the impact of a bumper. The ocean couldn't care less what happens to the water. But this specific whirlpool with your name on it will be destroyed. And the majestic broadcast of the universe through this unique keyhole will be permanently interrupted. Reality may be a non-physical game, but it has incredibly strict laws. And as long as your consciousness is tethered to a biological avatar, you are obliged to obey the rules of its specific level. That is why awakened masters do not recklessly jump off roofs and do not step in front of cars. They cross the road on a green light, diligently pay taxes, and gently take care of their bodies. The only difference is that they know they are not this fragile little figure. They are the boundless space in which this game effortlessly unfolds. And this inevitably brings us to the most important point. If the brain is merely a receiver and personality is just a temporarily running program, what does that change? Actually, everything. All anxiety, psychological pain, and human suffering hang precisely on a single thought. They depend on the blind belief that you are a small, separate fragment of the universe that was born one day. A fragment that must constantly survive and defend itself against a vast, hostile world. The paralyzing fear of death exists only because there is an absolute conviction, I can die. But the paradox is that the character cannot die because it was never alive to begin with. And that pure awareness which you truly are was never born. Therefore, it cannot disappear. When the biological interface exhausts its resources, no cosmic tragedy will occur. Space will not collapse. The projected film will simply end. The whirlpool will just quietly dissolve, becoming the smooth, undisturbed surface of the ocean once again. If you have followed the argument up to this moment, it might temptingly seem to you that you have grasped the essence. You have intellectually understood the mechanics of reality. Perhaps you are thinking, I get it now. I am the unified consciousness. But the humbling truth is, any state, even the most elevated feeling of cosmic connection, deep emptiness, or the dissolution of the I, is still just a state. It is an experience. It is a mental result. Attempting to comprehend the complete absence of mind using the mind is like watching a film on a screen and trying to use the fictional characters to explain how the mechanical projector works. It is a vicious circle. The system fruitlessly uses itself to explain itself. The cunning ego simply puts on the shiny mask of an enlightened observer who is now enjoying the avant-garde concept of non-existence. Therefore, let us be completely honest. This very text is just as much of an illusion. These words are just background noise inside the film. They ultimately explain nothing, because absolute truth cannot be packaged into a clever result or a thought. You do not need to frantically try to capture this emptiness. You do not need to search for the source using perception, because perception itself is already the downstream consequence. All that remains when absolutely all concepts fall away, even the romanticized concept of awakening, is simply life. Just this passing second. The smell of coffee, the noise of cars outside the window, a breath. Not as a result of a grueling spiritual search, but simply as the only thing that actually is, before the mind has managed to casually name it. There is no one else here, and there never was. So you can finally put down the map and just feel it.